Alright, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are watching this video clip means that you've probably finished chapter 2, which is great. We're now getting to chapter 3. Chapter 3, in a way, may be slightly more complex, more difficult, because it starts to deal with the complexity that we face in the environment. Now, in chapter 2, I make the point that currently the way in which we scan the environment is through tried and tested methodologies, PESTEL, Porter's Five Forces. We have structured processes and frameworks within which we fit the environment into. So a fairly straightforward chapter. But I asked the question whether the current way in which we're conceptualizing the environment is adequate. And the reason why I ask it is to get companies to think about how do we capture and conceptualize the dynamism in the environment. So there we very much have to deal with complexity in the business environment, and henceforth it makes chapter 3 a little bit of a more difficult chapter, because we're starting to talk about new things such as emerging newness and systems complexes, emerging systems complexes. So the jargon tend to be a little bit more difficult. But again, I'm going to use this video clip just to break it down and in a way almost simplify it in terms of understanding it. The complexity that I refer to in chapter 3, and I try to elaborate quite extensively on that in chapter 3, is the complexity we find that's based on the interrelatedness and interdependence between two systems. Let me give you a simple example, and I use the example in the book as well. If you observe a system in isolation, the basket of information, or the informational compound, all the information in other words that you can extract, will be limited because it's based on viewing that system in isolation. However, if you start to look at other systems with which that system that you're scanning has a interrelatedness and interdependence with, you will be able to identify an additional dimension of information. That's what we call the emerging systems complexes. That's where the systems, to use this picture here as an example, where they overlap. That's the grey overlaps that I refer to there. And in that overlap, in that interdependence and interrelatedness, lies components, pockets of information, which you wouldn't have been able to get if you did not look at the interrelatedness and the interdependence specifically. Let me give you a very quick, simple example. Let's imagine that you have an opportunity to come and attend one of my presentations, and you make an observation of staying in front of the class, and at the end of the day you leave and you enjoy the session, and let's say that the impression that you have, the perception you have, in other words, the amount of information you have of Steyn is okay. He knows his subject matter, he's an expert, he's a nice guy, seemed to be a solid family man, and all the other nice characteristics and traits that you got out of observing me in isolation in front of a class or an audience talking or doing a presentation. Now let's assume that you happen to go to the airport 2 or 3 days later, and I'm just using the airport as an example, and there you catch me arguing with, let's say, a ground staff member who made a mistake on my flight, and I'm really arguing ferociously, and I'm swearing and using words that you didn't quite picture would come out of my mouth. Clearly that will impact on the amount of information you have of Steyn. It will alter your perception of me, and as a matter of fact add to the existing perception you have of me. Now let's just talk about, where did you now get that information? Well, you had to first and foremost catch me in that relationship where I have an interrelatedness and interdependence with the person, let's say at SAA, that I'm arguing with. Why is there an interdependence? Well, I'm dependent on this person to help me. I don't have another 14 airlines sitting at desks next to this desk, so that I can just simply say to this lady, okay, well, thank you very much, I'll never fly with you again, I'm going to go on to the next one. I don't have a choice, so I'm dependent upon this person, and that's why I'm arguing and fighting with her. Equally, there's an interrelatedness, because she is tolerating my aggression based on the fact that I'm a customer. She would like to tell me to take a hike, but she tolerates it because I'm a customer and she doesn't necessarily want to lose a customer. So that's what we talk about when we say you can only get that pocket of information about staying by looking at that interrelatedness and interdependency between these two people who are human systems. Are exactly the same. You can go and look at the interrelatedness and interdependence between government and labor. In our political genre, you have a tripartite alliance. You can go and have a look at the interrelatedness between that. The interrelatedness between suppliers and a government in terms of their BEE scorecards. What is the interrelatedness there? Are they managing to achieve the required statuses in terms of their BEE scorecarding so that you can do business with them, etc., etc. So that's what I talk about in chapter 3 primarily, a little bit more complex, but I give you a step-by-step practical ways in which you can unearth that specific information that I refer to as the emerging systems complexes. How do I analyze it? Do I need to break it down? Do I need to look at it as aspects, as dimensions, as characteristics? So I give quite a lot of explanation on that in this chapter. Again, highlighting the fact that you need to perform such an analysis through the application of a systems thinking approach, which really helps to look at that interrelatedness and interdependence, because systems thinking as a discipline is a way of thinking about something, it's a way of understanding the complete picture, looking at something in a holistic fashion, and the way in which systems thinking helps you to understand the complete picture is by focusing on the interrelatedness and interdependencies between components or aspects in a system, as opposed to viewing them in isolation. So I make a strong argument in chapter 3 that you need to look at it by means of a systems thinking approach. I talk a little bit about forecasting and foresight, the difference between the two, whether one is viewing the future based on where I am currently, and foresight viewing the future but viewing it from the future's point, almost with the end in mind, and then by means of what we call backcasting, again a systems thinking concept, determining what it is that I need to do as an organization to end up in that future state. So a little bit of an explanation in terms of the difference between forecasting and foresight. And then also, just to make matters slightly more complicated, I end off the chapter, and I say that tongue in the cheek, but with reference to what we call a complex adaptive system, which is a system that constantly emerges into a new form, new characteristics, new aspects, or new content of aspects, and it makes it fairly difficult to work with systems if those are the kind of systems that you need to work with in the environment that changes randomly, radically, quite intensely, very fast, much faster than in the past, and what do I need to do with it as an organization? So that, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 3, as I say, a little bit more complicated or complex. Read it. If you have to read it 2 times, then read it 2 times. Watch this video clip again. In essence, what it does is it introduces the so-called complexity that I referred to in chapter 2, and it gives organizations tools and mechanisms, ways in which you can unearth that dimension or pocket of information based on the interrelatedness and interdependencies between environmental systems, both in the external environment but also in the internal business environment. Thank you once again, and enjoy the read. Good luck.